Hello, Calvary family. Hey, great to be with you all. Happy Thanksgiving, all. Hey, today we start out with Genesis chapter 19. But before we start there, we got to go back and hit chapter 18 just a little bit to see what's happening. Remember, God showed up to Abraham there at his tent in chapter 18, and God's looking down at Sodom and Gomorrah, and he told how he is going to actively judge these cities of the plain because their sin had reached up to heaven. And so please note the time of day that they came, right? I mean, it was in
Daytime.
in the daytime. Yeah. And so when we start chapter 19,
It's already nighttime.
It's nighttime.
Interesting motif. We've seen that one before. Day and night motifs.
Yeah, so Abraham and Lot now they're being compared to one another, and note that as they do this, when we hit chapter 19, I mean, we start coming onto just a horrific, tragic, really, story. Again, another example of God's active judgment. The angels go down to Sodom. Lot meets them. The city folks know that they're not from there, right? They're out of towners. I don't know if they knew they were celestial beings or not. It's possible. Because again, we have these Noahic patterns that are going back and forth.
So it should sound a little bit like chapter 6 of Genesis to you. If you go and look at some of that language, it repeats itself a little bit here. And with the events. This is not a unique story in the Bible, actually, by itself. You will find a similar story in the end of Judges.
That's right. With Micah.
Easily the most graphic stories in the Bible. These were not uncommonplace, though, in the ancient world. What we're seeing here is something that, just to give you a little bit of context, is kind of a tragic but familiar story. This is kind of tribalism at its finest, where you get all... When you have outsiders, there's sort of this power play, and part of that is the horrific gang rape that you do see in this scene here.
And that's what the town folk want to do. They want to gang rape these two beings. And what's even tragic, I say more tragic, I don't know if you could get more tragic, but then Lot, in response to this, offers out his two daughters to be gang raped instead. And so the influence of being in Sodom has so corrupted Lot at this point in time. He thought that this was a viable solution to what those townfolk wanted to do.
And this might all kind of add up to being like, oh, of course, Sodom and Gomorrah are going to be wiped out. But there's a lot more going on in Sodom and Gomorrah. Later in the Bible, you'll see even Ezekiel will have this reflection on Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you want to read it yourself, it's Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49, and he'll tell you straight up what the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is, and he views it as actually their sin against the poor. These were very successful, very wealthy cities with a lot of overabundance, but there was a neglect of the poor, which is also, there are certain tribalistic traits in there that you could draw out. But go read that section in Ezekiel. He's very, very thorough on that.
Yeah, and as you read it, you're going to see how the platform or the foundation from which sin builds on. And so anyway, so we move on now to, well, actually, if you go to the end of 19, we have another crazy story.
It's a little bit ironic, but just like Lot offers to, really for his daughters to be sexually abused, they in turn sexually abuse him, which is, once again, if you want to look at Noah patterns, it's a very similar story to what's going on with Noah. So
right, and we have enemies.
Chapter 19.
The enemies are birthed out of that, right? The land of Canaan is birthed out of the thing with Noah, and now we have Ammon and Moab being born out of this particular sin. Now we go into chapter 20.
Yes.
Abraham is once again traveling south. Didn't go well the last time, if you remember. He pulled the Sarah is my sister card on Pharaoh, and God has to meet with him and do all that. Now he meets Abimelech, and the question is, what will he do?
Yeah. And you expect, there's an expectation at this point. He's a different man. He's no longer Abram. He's Abraham.
That's right.
But it plays out exactly the same. Just because God has worked with him and renewed him, given a new name, he's not yet lived up to that new name.
That's right. Patterns of deception are hard to break. Abraham's strategy to handle life problems and challenges at this point in time is to use deception.
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting though, is that not only does Abraham use this again, but we're going to see next week, Isaac is going to use the same exact solution, use deception, say Rebecca's my sister, instead of his wife. And the same kind of tragic thing goes on as well.
Yeah. And just in something interesting is just to contrast this to the last story like this. Notice how God interacts very graciously with Abimelech. There's some interesting things. Some things have changed since last time, and so definitely you should compare those two stories.
Then chapter 21, Isaac is born.
Yes. Yeah. It's been a long time since this promise was given. If you look at the timeline, it's been decades. Isaac is finally born. It's the fulfillment of that promise. But did it take patience?
Yeah. And then notice verse 6, Sarah is once again laughing, but now this laugh is not one of unbelief like before, but now it's one of joy. And the interesting thing, it's going to soon be quenched by another laughter.
Yeah, one in mockery from Ishmael, the son that she despises.
And that doesn't go well for Ishmael.
No, not at all. So you get this scene where Hagar once again has to flee. Well, actually, this time she's sent away. And there's some interesting later reflections in Galatians, which we'll talk about in a minute. But notice that God does visit. He revisits Hagar again in her oppression, and he reminds her of his promise, that God is with her. And then he goes on with the promise, and he gives this whole promise that Ishmael is going to be protected, he's going to be safe, and he'll even have a future. It's a very encouraging promise.
Yes. And so Isaac is the son of promise. Ishmael, if you look at Galatians, Ishmael is the son of the works of the flesh. And that's the contrast in the book of Galatians. Yeah. And so you're in grace with Isaac, the promises of God, or you're under the works of the flesh, which can never produce righteousness. Yeah. But going back to the person, God makes promises to Ishmael. He also makes promises to Isaac. Yeah. And that brings us into chapter 22.
Chapter 22, one of the most infamous Abraham stories. This is going to be the sacrifice of Isaac, right? And it's got quite a reputation. One of the things that's really interesting reading this is the biblical authors, it's very evident here, they don't always tell you what the characters in the story are thinking. Right? Very rarely. You want to know, because for us, that's our expectation as a Western audience is we want to know, all right, what are their thoughts going into this? Why do they do what they do? But we're not told that. And that's intentional. No. That's there's a reason that they don't tell you that. And I think that part of that is that we can reflect on the story then, and in a sense, we get to read ourselves into it. It's a very interesting story.
And then outside of the actual happenings of Isaac and the sacrifice and everything, there's a whole nother level of events going on at the same time. And that is Abraham is acting out prophecy. Now, Does he know it? Well, not initially. But if you notice the language, just look at chapter 22 and read some of the language and listen to what God says about Isaac. He says, take your son, your only son, Isaac. But didn't he have another son? Right? We just saw that, right? But listen to God, your only son, or King James is your only begotten son.
That does sound familiar.
A little, right?
We've been there.
John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And then where's Abraham to go sacrifice his son? The land of Moriah. Where's the land of Moriah? Well, it's a mountain range. It's also called Jerusalem, or the mountain range of Jerusalem. The high point of the mountain range would be a place that we call Golgotha. That's outside the city walls of the old city in the first century, and that is the place of Calvary where Jesus would be crucified.
Absolutely.
And so, we have a lot of details in here. We're not going to use all the time up on this, but you can run and find them. Here's just one other fun fact about this. The first time lamb is used in the Bible is found here, and it's in a question. Isaac says, where's the lamb for the burnt offering in verse 7? And it's interesting, the first time lamb is used in the New Testament, chronologically, is by John the Baptist. And when he sees Jesus, he says, behold,
the Lamb of God.
Right, who takes away the sins of the world. Right. So the Old Testament asks the question, where's the lamb for the sacrifice? The New Testament answers it. And again, a lot of other details, 3 days and all that, and we see, and so forth.
Now, if we're to revisit the story itself, sometimes we can get weird with the way we read into it. We start asking these questions. Like, one of the common ways is like, oh, well, what would I do if God asked me to sacrifice my son? And that's not the point of the story.
Right.
Like, notice up until this point, Abraham has not stopped playing games, right? He's been given the promise time and time again. And the promise is that Isaac is going to be the child of promise. The last we saw last week, he wanted Ishmael to be the son of promise. He's like, going to take Ishmael instead. This is God asking Abraham to put it all on the line. No more deceptions, no more games, no more tricks. If he trusts God's promise, he knows for a fact that Isaac is not going to die. Now, we don't know what his thought process is. We don't know if he expects Isaac to be resurrected, for God to stop the knife. That he says that he's going to have he's expecting a resurrection.
That's right.
We're not told this in the story, but we can read into it and we see God is asking everything of him. When God tests people, it's how he tests his chosen ones. He doesn't test them to find out what they're made of. He knows who we are. He knows who we are better than we know who we are. God tests his chosen ones because he needs them to know who they are and what they're made of. And when the moment comes down to it, kind of like Adam and Eve standing underneath the tree, what choice are they going to make? And so here we see that choice, and Abraham finally lives up to that faith.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a beautiful, beautiful story. Abraham is the man of faith now. So that moves us into chapter 23. Chapter 23, we see the death of Sarah. And we see this whole property deal go down as well with that. And that's an important little piece.
Yeah, so something to think about there. It's an interesting story, right? You have the whole scene with the Hittite and Abraham's haggling with them. Abraham insists on buying the land. And there's some symbolic stuff that we kind of missed there. So just to kind of draw it out a little bit, that land that he buys is part of the promised land.
Yes.
Abraham is committing to it. There's a reason it takes place right after the story of him putting it all on the line, right? You only bury your dead in your homeland. He buys the title deed to that land. Not only is he committing to owning this land that God promised to him, but he is saying, this is my homeland now. He's committing to that promise.
And all my generations after me as well.
Absolutely.
And so you'll even see Joseph, when he dies in Egypt, he will command Israel not to forget him and to bring his body back to be buried in the same place.
Absolutely.
And then now that moves us into chapter 24. And again, read the account. It's interesting that this happens right after the sacrifice of Isaac. Actually, I should say, we don't see Isaac again after the whole sacrifice scene. And now we see this whole scene about this unnamed servant going to get a bride for Isaac. And then on his return, the first time we see Isaac again is when he comes out for his bride. So a lot of little prophecy pictures going on there.
Yeah. And then chapter 25, we're going to see Abraham's death. And here from there, the storyline, it goes through Isaac and into another unexpected son, which is Jacob, the younger son. Which when we get into that, that's going to be quite the trip.
So that's our section for this week. And so we'll pick up with Jacob and Esau next week and see how Jacob becomes also a man of God.
Absolutely.
God bless you guys. Happy Thanksgiving. See you on Sunday.